The American Civil War was by far the bloodiest in our country's history. Uh, we, for a long time, we thought that it killed 620,000 Americans, about 2% of the American population, a little bit more than that. More recently, we've done additional research, and our findings are that the death toll is closer to 800,000, about 3% of the entire American population, which at that time was about 27 million people. So this was just an absolutely devastating war. And there are two things that I want you to get out of this this block of instruction primarily. The first is to give you a sense of what what an actual Civil War campaign and battle and so forth was like. In other words, to give you what a lot of you probably came into this course to to get is some drums and trumpets and the smell of gunpowder and that kind of a thing. You'll get some of that over this week and the next. But more importantly, I want you to understand the way in which the American Civil War represents a titanic failure of the American democracy and a warning to us about the fragility of our republic, how we nearly lost it once, and how easily we could lose it again. At any given time in our history, the United States is always exactly 20 years or so away from complete disaster, the extinguishment, the extinguishing of the republic. Because if even a single generation of Americans fail to behave as citizens, fail to uphold the civic virtue that democracy requires in order to be healthy, the United States could easily go the same way as have so many democracies in the world in the 20th century and 21st century. That is to say, to slide into authoritarianism. We think of democracy as something, well, why wouldn't you want to have democracy? That democracy is naturally appealing and so forth. Well, not so much. Many people are outcome driven rather than process driven. And if the process doesn't get them what they want, they're going to find another process that will, another way of getting things done that will. And so in many parts of the world, people, they tried democracy. It didn't get them what they wanted immediately. Democracy is messy. Democracy takes time. There's setbacks. There's all kinds of stuff like that. And so they went to authoritarianism. And Russia and China particularly, champions the view that, hey, we have a government that can get things done. We say we want to build this amount of infrastructure, or we want to do this, and it happens. Authoritarianism works. Look at democracy. Look at what a train wreck democracy is. Look at the United States right now. Look at the idea that millions of Americans can't even agree on who won the last election. Look at the spectacle of hundreds of Americans invading the U.S. Capitol. Does that look like anything that you want to have in your country? Does that look effective? No. And this is the same logic that applied in the 19th century. People were making the same arguments in the 19th century, that republics and democracies did not work. And when the United States fell into a civil war in 1861, it seemed to vindicate the idea that republics and democracies were a pipe dream, and that the only kind of governments that really worked were monarchies and empires. And so when Abraham Lincoln spoke here, because what in the background is the Gettysburg National Military Cemetery on the side of the battlefield, and that's the Soldiers' National Monument behind him. When Lincoln spoke here, he spoke specifically about the Civil War as a contest to determine whether government of the people, by the people, for the people was actually viable. You know, the whole world, in a sense, whether it was looking closely at the American Civil War or not, the outcome was crucial. You know, had the federal government, the United States, lost the American Civil War, it probably would have destroyed American democracy entirely, North and South, for reasons I don't have time to get into. And it would certainly have struck a tremendous blow to those the world over who were proponents of Republican government, proponents of democracy. A great deal was at stake here. And so that's the second and more powerful thing that I want you to understand about the American Civil War, is as an object lesson to us for how much we could lose and how quickly we can lose it. And so there are many ways to talk about the causes of the American Civil War, which sort of, there are just all kinds of explanations. And in a regular Civil War course, I might sort of, work through, all of them. We don't have time for that. And I can pick my targets. And the target I want to pick is, I think, an important one. And that is the role played by toxic politics. Same kind of politics we've got going today. So by the end of this presentation, you should understand, first of all, the founders' concept of the American Republic. Then the concept of civic virtue. Next, the emergence of what used to be called Jacksonian democracy, what we now think was white man's democracy, because real democracy would have involved political participation of African Americans, African American men and women and white women. In other words, so many Americans were excluded from this particular democracy that the fair thing to do is to call it a white man's democracy, because that's the accurate way to think of it. Well, this white man's democracy had tremendous implications for American political culture, and we're going to get into that. Next, the paranoid style in American politics, and how the rhetoric of violence in the pre-Civil War period created the reality of violence in the 1850s. And then the disruption of American democracy in 1860, which was the tipping point that tumbled the United States into outright civil war. Everybody knows what this painting is about. This is the painting of the signing of the Declaration of Independence, July 4th, 1776. In point of fact, the Declaration of Independence was signed over a period of months, but it was adopted by the Continental Congress formally on July 4th, 1776, sure enough. Let me relate this painting to the Civil War from the angle of vision of none other than Ohio-born Union General, Major General William T. Sherman, who insisted that the Civil War stemmed from what he called an excess of democracy, end quote. He had a point. The founders had established a republic, not a democracy. Well aware that historically most republics had failed. And what a republican form of government is rather than power coming from above in the shape of a king or an emperor or something along those kinds of lines, power is held by the people themselves. It's held below by the citizens. Okay, and this sounds like, wow, who would not want to be a part of a republic? Well, who would want to be part of a government that tends to just fall apart, that tends to be so fragile that it can't survive? The founders decided to make the United States a republic with no small degree of trepidation. because they understood how much the success of a republic depended upon a citizenry that possessed and would exercise what they called civic virtue. And civic virtue means the capacity to understand the complexities of government and a willingness to make choices based not on narrow self-interest, but on what was best for the Commonwealth, for the Republic as a whole. And the founders believed that only a certain segment of the American population, even of the white population, was capable of possessing and exercising this all-important quality of civic virtue. And so to ensure that only people with this kind of civic virtue could participate in political life, could vote, could hold public office, they instituted property and residency requirements so that only those with a strong stake in the community could vote. Furthermore, they placed a premium on consensus, and they had no conception of political parties as we understand the term. They instead regarded strong differences in political opinion as evidence of a destructive, quote, spirit of faction. And so they didn't think of different political parties as instrumental in governance. They saw different political parties or political factions as evidence that the republic was not working, as evidence of faction, as evidence of a kind of a tribalism that could quickly destroy a republic. And as I was looking at my script and thinking about what I was saying, it may very well be that we are back to thinking not in terms of political parties, but in terms of political factions. Just think about how tribalistic American politics have become, to the point where there are Republican parents who would object if their daughter dated a Democratic boy, and vice versa. I'm not making this up. There are public opinion surveys and so on that that demonstrate this. Just think about how liberal parents would feel if their daughter came home with an out-and-out Trump supporter, and how would a family that were great believers in President Trump, if their son came home, or son or daughter came home with a liberal, because of course they're not liberals, they're never liberals. There are radical leftists and socialists and communists and so forth like this. And of course, and on the other hand, the rhetoric is that of fascism. We are in many ways not far from the position that the founders feared we were going to be in. Well, why is that? Well, despite the founders' wishes, the American Revolution unleashed forces that by the late 1820s had transformed the republic into a democracy. A democracy was something the founders were very, very chary of, because this democracy was characterized by universal white male suffrage. Women, African Americans, remained largely excluded. Political parties emerged with strongly contrasting views on government and an ability to mobilize voters unmatched in American history. Voter turnout frequently reached 80%, even in local elections, 80%. And the way that the parties got supporters and garnered votes was by flattering the common man, the common white man, I should say. And these parties argued, in effect, that the common white man had the requisite civic virtue precisely because he was common. And they relentlessly exploited the fears of voters and routinely portrayed the opposition as a threat to liberty, a trait since characterized as the paranoid style in American politics. Shamelessly partisan, newspapers of the day slanted the news in favor of their preferred political party. They were little more than extended editorial pages. Initially, this system worked. The two major parties during this period, they were called the Whigs and the Democrats, were about equally matched and enjoyed support in all parts of the country. So you had Northern Whigs and Southern Whigs, Northern Democrats, Southern Democrats. Okay. And they vied in electoral contests with very close outcomes. I mean, these were two truly competitive political parties. And when you went into the voting booth, the outcome really could turn on your ballot because so many elections were close. Nowadays, things are gerrymandered to the point where you know for sure whether your candidate is going to win or candidate's going to lose. That's not the way it was back then. These parties were tremendously effective at mobilizing an electorate, and the way that they did it was by convincing them not only that that they could influence the outcome of what was going on in terms of policies and so forth, but that their political participation was vital because there were demons to defend against and incipient tyrannies to oppose and potential enslavers to avoid. Again, the paranoid style in American politics. Well, slavery. Well aware that slavery had the ability to split the country along sectional lines. For 2 decades, Whigs and Democrats managed to exclude it from national political life. The war with Mexico, however, 1846, 1848, raised a vexing issue: whether to permit slavery in the vast territories the United States had acquired as a result of its victory over Mexico. Because at the end of the day, the United States acquired about half of Mexico in terms of its land area. And from then on, once this question came out, okay, we acquired these great new territories. Will slavery be there or not? Once that question, got out in the public discourse at the national level, politicians never found a way to contain the slavery question. And by 1854, a major new party, the Republicans, had emerged largely on the basis of its opposition to slavery in the Western territories. At stake was a fundamental question about the nature of the United States. Was it at bottom a free republic with pockets of slavery, or a slaveholding republic with pockets of freedom? In other words, were the northern states that did not have slavery, was that the real American Republic, with the southern states that did have slavery as the outlier, the aberration, or was it the other way around? That's the key question that had white Northerners and white Southerners ultimately sort of almost at each other's throats. Now, compromise on this issue was possible. It had been done in the past, could have been done in the 1840s and 1850s. Most Republicans did not object to slavery per se, and only a small minority regarded as a moral imperative the immediate, uncompensated emancipation of slaves and the extension of full legal, political, and social equality to African Americans. And that small group were called the abolitionists, and they were a tiny minority in American life. Most white Americans who opposed slavery opposed it for reasons other than any concern for African Americans or their freedom or their quality of life.